Hey everyone, welcome back to the Thing About Wildlife in a Nutshell, where you will hear a bite sized story from our guest wildlifers' time in their field. Our lives among nature tend to be a string of funny, intimidating, or even simply absurd anecdotes, and I'm going to be bringing these to you through some wonderfully diverse and fascinating voices. In today's episode, I spoke with Parvati Prasad, a research affiliate at Conservation Initiatives and a PhD student at Deakin University. Affectionately called Paru by those who know her, she went from being an excited wildlife tourist as a child to unexpectedly making a career out of it. She spoke to me about her early research in the Western Ghats, following which she found her way to the dynamic ecosystems of Assam in northeast India. After being introduced to Kaziranga and its mega herbivores, she chose to stay put and study its elephants for her PhD. She took me on a journey through the tea estate mosaic landscape she currently works in, and I loved chatting with her. I hope you enjoy listening in too. A quick aside to let you know that both Paru and I were rather congested with some weather induced coughs while we did this recording, so we both apologize for the bits where we sound scratchy or nasal. And now, on to today's episode with Parvati Prasad, the thing about tea and elephants. Hi, Parvati. How are you doing today? Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Shika. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it as well. And I think this has to be like some kind of record for the species because this is going to be the third time we are on an episode on Thing About Wildlife talking about elephants.
But that's lovely.
Yeah, but of course, I think it's a species that is so dear to so many people in the field that just probabilistically it ends up being the case where there are so many elephant people to talk to. I'm very happy to have another one of you.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Let's start off easy and like right at the beginning and tell us a little bit about just how you ended up in this field because I know you worked in beautiful wildlife hotspots in the country. How did that all begin? How did you find yourself where you are now?
I think my interest in wildlife started at a very young age, quite early on in life as a young tourist. I grew up in Bangalore and in quite an urban world. But my dad is interested in wildlife, and so as a family, we would always go to forests in Karnataka for our holidays. And I think that's where my interest started. It wasn't just about going to the forest to sight a predator or some fascinating sighting, but anything, just being in the forest and any common sighting like a cheetal suckling its fawn or something as simple as that interests me. And I think that's where it started off. And for I think most of my school life, that's pretty much how I viewed it, and that's all it was. I hadn't thought about taking this up professionally until my college days. But when I was in the 12th, so in Karnataka 12th is pre-university, so I was in a college setup, and my college had a nature club that had just started, and I saw a poster about it, and I wanted to be part of it. Mostly, I mean, I viewed it as something that I could be part of and learn from. So then I approached the people who had started the nature club. The club was in its absolutely initial days. In addition to just members interested in wildlife, they were also looking for people who were potentially interested in thinking of possible things to do, activities, planning activities, organizing activities as part of the club. And so I took on that role along with a few others. I found that entire process really interesting. In planning the activities, thinking of what to do, there was so much for me to learn. And that was also around the time when I got into birding within Bangalore. So I started learning more about birds. We went on a few treks as part of the group, and all of that was a new kind of experience in the wild for me, different from what I'd been exposed to previously. And in that process of organizing events and learning more about wildlife, I think somewhere I thought that, maybe this is something I want to do. And by then I was also really sure that I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to be an engineer either. So I thought this was something that interested me. And I was also a student of biology, but I still hadn't taken it up seriously during my undergrad. I did my undergrad in biotechnology. I did consider environmental science, but I was sort of dissuaded from taking that path. And so I didn't. But I think during my undergrad, I realized that I wanted to take up wildlife more seriously and professionally. So I volunteered for a couple of projects. And after my undergrad, I took up my first project in this field and as a research assistant. And I think that was my introduction to this field.
I'm really glad you brought up a couple of things in this whole formative years period that a lot of us have gone through before getting into the field. One was, you said you first enjoyed wildlife as a tourist, and I think like we also underestimate the value of that a lot, right? Because I think if you actually go out and see it, no strings attached, you're not there for work, you're just there to just appreciate everything around you, it can really leave a lasting impact. I think that's so nice. It's so good to hear. And even these nature clubs, I think it's there in every school, and there are so many practitioners who do even little outreach programs here and there. And I don't think a lot of practitioners realize that maybe one or two amongst these kids who they've just interacted with is going to make a whole career out of it.
True.
I think that's such a humbling feeling. I think like that always keeps me going every time I do a little bit of outreach here and there or engage with education. I just love the idea that maybe like when I was in school and how much I loved my nature clubs. And I know I remember, random activities we did even now. It's really nice to imagine that, oh, maybe 20 years from now, one of these kiddos will be doing something. Yeah.
That's true.
So tell us a little more about this first project you did and where it was. You've of course already in your childhood been exposed to the wildlife of Karnataka, which is like in the heart of the Western Ghats, and of course just one of the most incredible early landscapes to explore. And it's so fun to have been in a place like Bangalore, which is central, and you get to access a lot of these places nicely. So was the first project you did also in Karnataka?
Uh, yeah, it was. So the project was with Center for Wildlife Studies. I worked as a research assistant with Dr. Kritikara on a project that looked at human-wildlife interactions around protected areas in Karnataka. So this project was completely new to me because for the first time I wasn't looking at wildlife from just wildlife's perspective, but in terms of wildlife and interactions with people. And as part of the project, I went to villages that surround protected areas and interviewed people who live there on what it feels like to live around wildlife, their experiences with wildlife, and their interactions with wildlife. And this was something that was extremely new to me, and I hadn't thought about wildlife in that sense, and I hadn't thought about what it must feel like to live next to a protected area. It was also my first time in rural India, in that I'd never spent that much time in rural India. It was often just me passing by villages, and that was pretty much it. But this was the first time I was there on ground interacting with people, and that was a whole new experience for me. And this was also the first time I was handling a group of volunteers and was in charge of a team. Overall, it was a really good learning experience for me, and it introduced me to the field of wildlife research. And yeah, I think that was where I realized that I wanted to continue in this field and got more interested in research.
Wow, that's quite the deep dive from having only interacted with it informally growing up, and then suddenly you're doing so many multiple things from a very serious standpoint. So from there, you ended up in a completely different system, actually, that now you're working in Assam, which is so far removed. But also hyper biodiverse, also has some species, especially the large mammals, are similar. Perhaps there are also some similarities with respect to human wildlife interactions. But I think, as if I'm not wrong, you're also looking more at the species themselves right now in Assam. So, how did this happen? How did you find your way all the way across to the northeast of India, which is polar opposite in terms of geography as well? So, yeah, tell us about that.
Uh, so when I started working in the Northeast, I didn't actually get to the Northeast with the intent of doing so. I mainly wanted to work on projects that were looking at research from a more ecological point of view, because that is something that I felt that I was lacking at that point. So I approached Dr. Varun Goswami and Dr. Divya Vastev because I knew of their work and I knew they were working on some really interesting projects. And I thought it would be great to work with them and learn from them. So I approached them, and they already had ongoing projects in the Kaziranga landscape in Assam, and they thought that maybe I could. There was a place for me there, and they asked me if I was interested, and I most definitely thought it was a great opportunity to work with them, and as well as in a new landscape.
So, what was it about Assam and Kaziranga that has kept you there for now quite a few years, and has also ended up being the landscape in which you found a species you want to focus on, you found a research question around which you wanted to do a PhD? There's clearly something that's drawn you to this place. So, what was it that has kept you there?
That's a really interesting question. And I think there are several things that I really liked about Kaziranga and the project that I'm working on that kept me here. One is that elephants have always been my favorite animals. But up until then, I'd never really thought about working on elephants as such. The project that I was part of when I joined Varun and Divya was focused on elephants, and the project was to look at the population dynamics of elephants in Kaziranga National Park. So when I started working on the project, it really interested me, and I really enjoyed working on the project. I think it sort of kept me going. In addition to that, I think the landscape itself is both beautiful and extremely interesting, and it also makes for a great study system. Kaziranga is an extremely fertile landscape and is also a dynamic floodplain. And the national park itself is surrounded by tea gardens to a very large extent. And there are also other forest patches in the landscape. And elephants sort of move from Kaziranga to these forests and between these forests. And the one thing that makes this landscape really interesting is that the national park itself, because of Brahmaputra on its northern bank, floods on an annual basis, and the system changes so much within the course of a year. And I thought that was a very interesting system to study. And in addition to the forest fragments themselves, elephants in this landscape move through tea gardens to access both refuge during floods, which are in the hills, and as well as to move between forest fragments within the landscape. And in that sense, there are so many different aspects that one can look at, and that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds like there's just so much going on there. I'd assume that if you spend enough time there, you're going to get curious about the different aspects of this entire system. It sounds really, really interesting. So now you are looking mainly at elephant behavior, if I'm not wrong, right? In this landscape and in this mosaic. And of course, everyone listening probably knows of and has had tons of Assam tea. But I think we also very often dissociate the fact that there is Assam tea available to everybody in the country and even abroad. All of this tea is coming from somewhere, and that all of Assam is actually covered in tea estates, and there's just so much tea everywhere, which, of course, like you're saying, limits the places in which animals like elephants can move. And so they're all moving across these really interesting landscapes. So tell me a little bit more about your actual day out in the field? Do you work with the elephants as they're moving through this mosaic? At what points do you observe them? What is the entire system like on an average day for you?
So there are a couple of projects that I've been part of. One is, like I said, the population estimation survey itself, which involves individually identifying elephants. Our team at Conservation Initiatives, which is the organization that I'm part of, so we go into the park and photograph elephants in a systematic manner. And then we maintain a database of it. And in addition to looking at elephant numbers and population dynamics, the one other thing that this also allows us to do is to look at the socio-ecology of elephants, which is interspecific interactions. And that's one component that I'm interested in and I'm looking at. The other aspect is what you were just talking about, which is elephant behavior in tea gardens. So, like I said, elephants move through tea gardens to access forest patches, and in that sense, they interact with people there on a regular basis. So, I'm trying to look at what these interactions look like, and this then involves me being on ground and following elephants on foot. When I'm undertaking that project, my day begins very, very early. So at just before sunrise, which is early in the Northeast to begin with, we're out at 4 a.m. Following elephants, looking for elephants. And then once we find elephants, I get to follow them on foot for the rest of the day.
Wow, I'm sure you have a ton of stories from having followed them on foot and getting to watch them, because the elephants are also such expressive, dynamic creatures, and there's always so much going on. And the fact that you're directly interested in how they're interacting with each other within a herd, I'm sure you have many stories. But also this landscape, since you're looking at tea gardens, it all must also mean that you're coming across a lot of people in your day-to-day work, and you must be navigating them yourself along with the elephants navigating people for the same reasons. So what is that like? Tell us some stories from field.
That's true. Being in the field gives you a lot of interesting stories and interaction. So while my research doesn't actually involve me talking to people on ground, I'm always present around them, and I can always overhear some interesting conversations or interesting things happening around me. For the most bit, when people are present on ground, the one thing that sort of stands out is that everybody is interested in elephants, irrespective of what they do with that interest, irrespective of how they respond to elephants. Everybody really is interested in elephants and are curious about the species. So often we get to stand in the tea gardens and people around us are discussing what elephants are up to. They're standing there watching elephants as well, and they're wondering what a particular behavior may be and what something else is. They're really excited when they look at young ones and things like that. But then there are some stories that sort of stand out. And I think my favorite one is of these two guys that I encountered in one of the tea gardens. So essentially, on one of the days, we were following elephants, and it was a fairly large herd. And this herd was passing through a tea garden. And right next to the tea garden is a government school. And the two kids that I'm talking about are students in that school. And they're really young. They must be in class 2 or 3. Really tiny, barely taller than the tea bushes. But they were right in front of us watching elephants, and I don't think they realized that we were around them. And at one point, they started having this really deep discussion about what they should do with the rest of their day, whether they should go to school or if they should continue following elephants for the rest of the day. And obviously, they picked the latter because that is so much more interesting, and that is what they continue to do. So there are many such instances that are, I don't know, quite entertaining for us.
That also seems like the decision you ended up taking with your life. Do I go back to school or do I follow elephants?
Fortunately for me, my field combines both.
Oh, that's so lovely. That also, makes me wonder, how has it been for you with the language? Because you went from growing up in Karnataka to now having worked in Assam for so long, you even know the language and you're able to talk to people. How did that happen? Was that hard to do?
It was slow and most definitely funny. Um, I think both for me and people around me. So, Assamese is not too difficult for somebody who's familiar with Hindi because the structure is somewhat similar. But when I first went there, yeah, I absolutely didn't understand the language. And in some sense, I don't know, it kind of bothered me, I guess, in that there is a bit of a gap in you completely embracing the landscape and feeling at home if you don't really know the language. So I definitely wanted to learn the language. The process of understanding the language enough to get what people are saying was fast, but to be able to speak was a really slow process. But I've had some extremely patient colleagues who are also great teachers. So they've very patiently taught me word after word, sentence after sentence. And to give them credit, I've said the funniest of things, but they've never laughed at me. And they've been so encouraging all along. So it's mostly because of them that I managed to learn the language. It was on them that I experimented, and I would start having small conversations with them. And then more recently, I think I talk to people in the tea gardens and people in the, people you interact with on a daily basis, like shopkeepers and people in the market in Assamese. And yeah, and to give all of them credit, I think they've been really encouraging, and people, even in the tea gardens, even though they know that this is, I mean, they know it's not my language, of course, they can see that I'm not extremely comfortable speaking it, and I know that I'm making grammatical mistakes. But they've all been very supportive, and they continue talking to me in Assamese, even though I may be saying silly things or maybe making mistakes. And that I thought was really nice.
That's lovely, and that's also very encouraging because I have a very selfish reason for for having asked you that question. Since I'm also going to be working in Assam very soon, and I don't know the language either, and I'm just hoping that people will put up with me and my mistakes while I try to navigate that. So, what next for you, Paru? I know that you are in the thick of a lot of field work, and but you seem to be very married to this landscape. Our very first episode in season one, where we spoke to Nishant, I remember him saying that to truly study elephants, you need to be with them for a minimum of 25 years. And is that a philosophy that you align with as well? What do you see for yourself now?
No, so I definitely not thought about it 25 years down the line. But as of now, I'm trying to focus on my PhD and hoping to finish it in the next couple of years or so. But given that I've worked in this landscape for this long, and I've worked on the research aspect for this long, I most definitely want to be involved in the conservation efforts that take place here as part of the organization, conservation initiatives that I'm part of. Beyond research, I definitely want to be part of the efforts that contribute towards management of human-elephant interactions here.
Of course, I know that that was a very unfair question to throw at you, but I like to have my bits of fun as well on this podcast. No, but I think that is a very, very pragmatic answer. And of course, it's very hard to think far off into the future when you're already trying to get through a PhD. But that's really great. And I think it's also lovely that you're part of an organization that is so firmly rooted in the Northeast and is very regionally specific, because I think that also probably allows you to do a lot more localized, meaningful, context specific work. Has that also contributed to how you feel about Assam? I'm sure it feels different to have to be part of an NGO or an organization that is that rooted in its geography.
Most definitely. I think I got lucky on that front because it certainly makes a difference to be part of an organization that is already based in that landscape. And before I was part of this team, members had already been there and worked there for a few years. So there were already projects happening, people were familiar with the landscape, and relationships with the tea gardens had been built. So that I think worked out really well for me. Our team at Conservation Initiatives has members from the local communities, from the tea gardens themselves, So then it really made it easier for me to go engage with the tea garden and build relationships there. And in addition to the team itself, I think the management and staff of the tea gardens also were extremely welcoming. And that definitely made a difference and made the process of working in this landscape easy for me.
That's so wonderful to know that you're working so closely with people who actively own these landscapes, and which now, like you're saying, is a big part of elephant habitat. It's not just the grasslands or the forest patches. So it's such an interesting mosaic. I think maybe my last question to you is going to be about the elephants, and what do you think the situation looks like for them? Because, of course, these are extremely intelligent, extremely adaptable species, but they are having to use such modified landscapes. They're going through tea gardens, and which is not ideal, but they seem to be using this landscape a lot. So, what do you think the situation is like for them? What is their future in Assam looking like to you?
And think about it. That's a really interesting question. And I'm obviously hopeful, which is sort of why I'm in this field also. And I think I'll talk about the Kaziranga landscape first. And to give people credit, I think people here are overall generally very interested in elephants and are really respectful of elephants. Elephants in the tea gardens are called, amongst the tea community, are called Baba. So in that sense, they really enjoy cultural reverence. But despite the support and importance they have in the tea gardens, there are obviously challenges to navigating these spaces. And I think that's where conservation comes in terms of management of human-elephant interactions, which is a huge challenge here. And I think if that is managed, if the right kind of measures are taken, then I think this landscape, which is already an excellent landscape for elephants, will continue to do well. And I think the situation for elephants elsewhere is somewhat similar in that in large parts of India, elephants are surviving in human-dominated landscapes where habitat patches are fragmented. And not every landscape is the same. So what works in one area may not work elsewhere. But measures that are sort of designed to the landscape and based on the requirements of the landscape, if efforts are undertaken, then I'm hopeful that elephants do well. But I certainly think that it requires large landscape scale approach, which sort of encompasses both protected areas and human use areas such as tea gardens.
I really hope your optimism stays true, because I think it's great that, like you said, you're part of a really cool NGO that has a lot of good local knowledge. They're interacting with the right kind of people. India is constantly mind-boggling in just how much tolerance and love people have for these creatures who they spend so much time with, despite the losses they face or issues they may face. There's still so much love and tolerance for a lot of these creatures, and it's always something that leaves you hopeful as a conservationist. So that's great to hear.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much, Paru. It's been really great talking to you. And I know I've put you on the spot with a couple of my questions, but you've been such a sport. Thanks, really. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me here, Rishika. This was a lot of fun, and I didn't mind that at all. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for listening.